Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out Devex.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development, the weekly podcast where we talk about all things global dev. I'm Raj Kumar, the President and Editor-in-Chief here at Devex, and I'm joined this week by two Devex colleagues, David Ainsworth and Adva Saldinger. Hey, David.
Hey, Raj. How are we doing?
Doing good. And David is, of course, our business editor. And hi, Adva.
Hi, Raj. How are you?
Doing great. Adva is a senior reporter here at Devex. Lots to cover this week. This is Pro Week. David, you want to just say a word about what Pro Week is, and then we'll dive into some of the content that we've got for people?
Yeah, sure. So Pro Week is a week for our professional subscribers. These are the people who've signed up to receive kind of all of our content here at Devex. And we've they're usually a group of kind of highly engaged individuals who really know what's going on in the world of development. And we've kind of spoken to them and asked them what they think of the core themes that they're really interested in. They've picked out a few of those themes, things like localization, AI, the future of the INGO, and we've kind of designed a week around what they told us they were really interested in, and put on a bunch of events, produced a bunch of special reports, really focused in detail on the needs of those guys, and so far as we can see, it's going extremely well. A lot of people have signed up to join us here on Devex Pro, really seen the value of it, and we've put on a couple of events which have been stonking successes. So I think we're pretty pleased with how everything is going.
Yeah, definitely. And a big thank you to everyone who signed up this week. And to, you guys don't get to see the list, right? It's not public. We get to see who our subscribers are. And it is an impressive group of big names, some names that just require a first name and you know who they are, our Devex Pro readers. And we just really appreciate everybody who helps support our journalism and who wants to get the inside story that we provide through Devex Pro. So along those lines, we had a really interesting insider piece about the future of the INGO. Maybe we start with that one, David, since that's one that our readers and listeners said they were really interested in.
Yeah, for sure. I found this a really interesting piece as well. The background to this piece is we've been speaking to a lot of INGO colleagues over the last few months. INGO chief execs are probably one of our biggest groups of subscribers, unsurprisingly, for people interested in kind of what's going on in the world of development. And there was just a little bit of existential angst, I think, among kind of INGO leaders about what the role is for their organization going into the future. INGOs have obviously been a massive part of development for years and years. They've been kind of an integral part of the system, delivering aid, holding governments to account, doing all sorts of different work. But obviously with the localization agenda, people feeling that maybe we should be increasing the level of local leadership, INGOs are asking a few questions about where they belong and what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Should they be kind of taking all this money? Should they be trying to get out of the way? We spoke mostly to INGO leaders for this piece, and I think they're obviously kind of talking about how they think there's a really valuable place for the INGOs still in the world of development, that the INGOs are doing important work, that they're going to remain part of the ecosystem. But at the same time, they're kind of in what one of our correspondents called the messy middle, as they kind of transition to different business models and start thinking about different ways of doing business. And one of the ways that we really kind of profiled in the piece was kind of moving from being the prime contractor to being the supporting agent, providing skills and know-how and contacts to local organizations actually delivering the work, who are then going to be more in charge of leading the process. And that's still very much a process in transition. We see INGOs still have very big balance sheets, still very dominant in the conversation, but it's something they're thinking really hard about.
Yeah, Bob, I'm curious what your take was on this story.
Yeah, no, I thought it was interesting, and it's something that obviously we've been seeing sort of play out over a number of years. I think one of the pieces that struck me, and it comes actually quite at the end of the article, and it's this idea that there's more and more alignment around the rhetoric from these big INGOs about the need for localization to change the model. But the implementation, I think, is where there still needs to be more work, right? That's where the challenge is, and that there is this dichotomy within these organizations of working themselves out of a job, so to speak, right? Because if you increase the localization, these INGOs may still have a role, but it will very likely be smaller with fewer staff, etc. And just one other piece in that story that I wanted to point out is that, the local organizations themselves said that sometimes these INGOs play a really critical role as sort of a backstop or a ballast to civil society organizations domestically in these countries, especially when it comes to conflict. And really just being eyes and ears from the outside world to get the story out about what's happening, and also to be actors in places or on issues where a local NGO might not be able to. So I thought that was also another sort of interesting aspect of this piece and the ongoing sort of evolution of the INGO.
Yeah, I thought that was important too, because there tends to be, we all know, fads in global development and localization. There's a danger that it becomes nothing but a fad where everyone sort of agrees with it, in a knee-jerk way, but doesn't think critically about what they're actually saying. And I thought that was a really important point that came out in the piece is, well, hang on a second. There are some advantages to being not local, to be able to come to a country and speak out for LGBTQ plus rights in a way that local organizations may not be able to, or to witness, human rights abuses or atrocities by government, and to talk about those globally in a way that might not happen if it's just a local organization. And so I think we're at a point now where there is a lot more nuance in the conversation, and we need to have that. In fact, I would push back a little on the broad theme here, because my feeling is it's not like all INGOs are created equal. I think if you're a small or mid-sized INGO, even long before 2024, you've been feeling a lot of pressure. It's been really tough. And, there's many cases of these kind of mid-sized or smaller INGOs that have ended up essentially going out of business or getting folded into larger ones. I think it's possible some INGOs, some of the really big ones, actually get bigger through this process, through this transition, and that it's the small and mid-sized ones that feel most of the pressure. I don't know that these trends are going to affect everyone equally, because there's so much more money coming into this space. It may not be government money, as we see foreign aid plateauing or going down in a lot of places, but there's a lot more philanthropy coming. Humanitarian needs are just escalating rapidly. And I think there is a role, if you're a global donor, you may want to fund a global organization that has a lot of geographic scale, that can work across many different sectors, and that says to you, don't worry, we work with a lot of local partners. We can deliver the funding there so that you as a foundation, you don't have to have 1,000 people in your headquarters to figure out who to fund and to do compliance. We've got that for you. So I do think it's going to be a new business model. Maybe it's going to shake things up. I don't dispute what many of the leaders we spoke to say in the piece, but I just don't know that it's a one size fits all.
There's some really interesting kind of themes in that. I mean, we gathered some data this week, which another story that maybe we'll talk about at some stage, which showed that the top 50 INGOs in the United States are worth $28 billion a year, and they're growing. They grew by 2.4% more than inflation last year. So certainly those large organizations are very significant. And I mean, they have huge fundraising and business development departments. They're very good at extracting money from the public. They're very good at extracting money from the American government. And they're very good at extracting money from philanthropic foundations. So I think even if their kind of instinct is to get smaller or to try and get out of the way, their business model is kind of, it's a runaway train. They're going to have trouble not raising the money, if you know what I mean. Like, it's all very well wanting to get out of the way and have somebody else receive it, but you have to kind of work out how you're going to ensure that if you get out of the way, it's not just some other massive INGO who comes in and gets the cash. And that obviously creates problems for funders and donors. How do we go about redesigning the way in which money is allocated in the development space so that it doesn't keep getting picked up by these enormous organizations that are so skilled at making sure that they're the ones in position to get it.
I do think the article pointed out some examples of where you've seen INGOs go in and really train up over a period of years local organizations so that then they can go and win bids the next time around. And so I think that's an interesting piece of this. But you're right, the model does have to change, and some of that has to come with funding. I thought one of the things that stood out to me in the piece was, there's often this excuse of, well, there isn't the capacity or they don't have the systems. And it was like, well, give us $5,000 to buy QuickBooks. Then we'll be able to comply with what you want us to do. But so sometimes I think there's this mismatch between what people say the problem is, and $5,000 is in general a drop in the bucket for an agency like USAID, right? So I think that was also something that stood out to me is, you could probably come up with some pretty pragmatic, maybe not too costly ways to mitigate some of these gaps or challenges.
Yeah, I saw that in the piece too about it. It just made me think, like, once again, here we are talking about taking an existing model, which has a lot of flaws, and localizing it, right? In other words, take the USAID or the FCDO model of projects, of grants and contracts, and just, instead of having the prime contractor be an international NGO, make it a local NGO. But does that maybe miss the mark? And I'm just imagining, lots of busy work doing compliance in QuickBooks, moving from Washington, D.C. to Juba. Like, I guess it's a benefit, that it's now happening locally, but is it development?
I think this gets to one of the key conversations around this, which is, one, are you changing the system? But it's this difference between localization as in funneling money through local organizations, and are the programs actually designed at a local level with local input in a way that serves local communities in the best way possible, right? And so if you just are sort of copy and paste local actor doing this in the same sort of system, maybe you're getting some benefits because they're going to understand the local context probably in more depth, but you may still be missing the mark on actually serving those communities in the best way possible. And so I think that's also an interesting sort of tension and debate. How do you both change the design or the structure of the system to really be local and not just, finding local people to replace the INGO?
Yeah, agreed. And it's worth noting that we're often talking about the very same people, right? Like these are probably the same staff who might work for an INGO and then would switch to working for a local organization if that local org was given the funding to be able to afford them. So it's kind of the same people. I mean, most international NGOs now have lots and lots of local staff. So, like, to me, one of the big issues is more about the cost of the international NGO. There's just the massive overheads, the inefficiencies. And, is there a way to change the business model? Because they already use local staff, but so much of the funding gets eaten up in the global staff and in all the compliance. And it's not that NGOs necessarily want to have all that compliance. I mean, some of it is important and needed, but a lot of it comes from government donors. So, the other big trends that are happening in our space is the shift from government funding to philanthropic funding. And in theory, philanthropies don't need to put that level of compliance on their work. And then also government funding increasingly shifting into development finance, in these more sustainable business models that have, revenue generation at their heart. And again, you have to wonder, like, where does this conversation fit into that if those are the other big trends about where money is moving?
Yeah, I thought it was notable when USAID produced some statistics recently, to go back a bit to the start of your point. They produced their statistics showing how they were doing against their localization targets. And they obviously produced some figures showing that they hadn't moved forward terribly much on their local funding targets. But I thought in some ways the local leadership target that they have, and this is, USAID has as a target that 50% of programs are going to be locally led by 2030. But they're really struggling to define what locally led even means. And they set a target for what they thought might be acceptable and realized that they'd already hit it. They'd already got over 50% with their existing model. And essentially they decided that the target was far too soft. And it seems like everybody's kind of struggling to understand what local leadership even looks like and what it means to be locally led. We're in a position where we're kind of just kind of getting to the start to kind of frame the terms of the debate is quite tricky. And I guess I feel like we're just a long way away from anybody really being willing to let local people actually take the lead on this. There's just a very great deal of risk aversion. You talked about compliance costs. And I think another thing that I get told repeatedly about funders is that they're much, much more interested in the risk of money going missing or being used fraudulently than they are in the risk that they don't actually do anything useful and they don't actually help anybody. And I don't quite know how we go about shifting that paradigm. To be honest, that seems to be pretty deeply ingrained in the thought processes of funders all over the world.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, these are some of the underlying fundamental things where it's easy to say. And in fact, I think if we polled our audience, they would generally say, yeah, localization is a good thing. We kind of all want that. And I've talked with, development professionals on the ground in global South countries who say, yeah, we need more localization. Like, this is crazy how even though we have gone away from lots of Americans and Europeans flying in and running these projects, that has diminished a lot in the last couple of decades. But still, control, budgetary authority, project design, like, it really still is led in the global north. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like, it's not the way to get things done, to get the right results, to make projects really locally owned and sustainable. So I think there's broad agreement on it, but how to actually fix that, as you say, David, is not so obvious, because there's some of the pressures that have caused this situation, this status quo, they are real, and they are not going to just go away at the snap of a fingers. And you saw that at the end of that piece, right? We had a quote from someone who sort of made that point and just saying, we've been talking about this for a while, and there is now broad agreement. So what do we actually have to do to get past this? And this person, Kim Kasinka, says, if it were easy to do, it would have been done by now, and mentions cultural barriers, change management barriers, structural barriers, resource barriers. And I think you're mentioning another one, David, which is power barriers. This idea that people don't want to give up control. And it sounds very negative. You could even position it as positive. Someone says, well, my job is I'm supposed to be responsible for these funds, whether they're foundation funds or taxpayer funds, and I have to make sure they're spent right. You can understand those reasons, and those don't go away easily.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that last point. As someone who follows the US Congress very closely, it would be hard to imagine Congress saying, yeah, you can take more risk and remove some of those provisions. I mean, I think there is some support behind some streamlining and efficiencies, but they still want that oversight. They still want to know that money isn't being wasted or diverted to sources where they think it shouldn't be going. And so I think that, that leadership challenge is, you will have to convince legislatures and leaders to really go out on a limb to change some of that. And it's very deeply ingrained, I think, in the way politics and policy works today.
Yeah, I think you're right, Yvonne. I think, that's one reason why development finance is increasingly exciting to lawmakers, because in a sense, it's potentially more bang for your buck, because there's, some revenue that comes off of these projects, let's say renewable energy projects, and you can actually localize it in some ways more easily, because you don't necessarily have to have the US government directly involved with taxpayer money on the line at the operational level. Like, maybe they're just guaranteeing something and they're working with lots of other partners that have their own compliance mechanisms. So it seems like development finance, is on the upswing. And when you look at the political situation all over the world, my sense is that development finance is going to continue to grow as a share of foreign aid.
The world is facing a range of health threats, from an increase in disease outbreaks to the health impacts of climate change. I'm Jenile Ravelo, Senior Global Health Reporter for Devex. Every Thursday, we bring you exclusive news and insights on how the health sector is finding solutions to these challenges in our free weekly newsletter, Devex Checkup. Visit devex.com/newsletters to subscribe.
And that leads me to maybe another piece that we could talk about from this week about PEPFAR, because PEPFAR, it represents a very successful program, but of the old mold, which was all around grant financing. And they're facing some real challenges because of the changing political winds. Adva, I don't know if you saw that piece, so maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about it.
So our colleague Michael Igo interviewed John Nkengasong, who's the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, ahead of the big global international AIDS conference this week. And I think, I mean, there are two things that's striking. A lot of our listeners might know some of the backstory, but PEPFAR has been traditionally a hugely bipartisan supported initiative founded by former President Bush. And what we saw last year was really the domestic politics of the US taking over the fight to reauthorize PEPFAR. And so the authorization lapsed for a number of months, and then it got a 1-year reauthorization, which sets up a fight next March, I believe, to reauthorize it again. You know, supporters had really hoped for a 5-year reauthorization, which is what's happened in the past in bipartisan ways. And so there's this real challenge in this piece that it really talks about the damage that sort of waning political will can have on the AIDS fight globally. So we're seeing that, you know, in the US, and I think there are questions about whether the Biden administration, and lawmakers are prioritizing something like PEPFAR. And Nkengasong, says in this piece that the Biden administration is. There's also been some debate about whether PEPFAR funding is declining. And the reality is that the actual dollars out the door will go down, but the administration hasn't asked for any less money. It just had money that hadn't been spent in previous years that it had been able to sort of use to fund programs, and that money has essentially run out. So they'll only have what they're appropriated on an annual basis. So I think that, could present some challenges as well. But I think, one of the things I was just reading this morning, because we have been covering this International AIDS Conference, and really PEPFAR has been a key theme at the International AIDS Conference. And this idea of sustainability, which Nkengasong talks a lot about in this interview, that it's got to be, beyond a PEPFAR. Countries need to take more ownership, and there needs to be a lot more planning around how countries can take ownership of the HIV/AIDS response.
Yeah, it's a fascinating issue when you think of PEPFAR for a couple of reasons. One is the politics, as you mentioned, where for many, many years, PEPFAR was sort of the golden example of a bipartisan initiative. And, it was created by a Republican administration. Some of its top supporters were evangelical Christian members of the U.S. Senate and the House. Mike Pence was a big supporter of this before he became vice president of the United States. So you just saw a lot of truly bipartisan support, and people were really proud of this program. And then to see it go from something that, people are so proud of to really having a tough time getting reauthorized at all, and only being reauthorized for a year, and then to be the subject of this new political phenomenon where you see some of the more right-wing members of the Republican Party labeling foreign policy and foreign aid initiatives as quote unquote woke, and kind of getting into those politics around gender. That's really a big shift for PEPFAR. That's a very tough political situation to find itself in. So I think that's one really interesting theme that PEPFAR fits into, and is maybe a reason why they're talking so much about it at the International AIDS Conference. But the other one goes back to our localization conversation, in that PEPFAR was early and successful in localizing. Right? They had a really big target. You might remember, I think it's 70% of their funding had to go to local organizations, and they really moved in that direction.
I think it's well over 80%.
Is it well over 80 now? Okay, yeah, I remember 70 is maybe the target. They probably exceeded it, but they were seen as a real success story when it comes to localization. And now it seems like they're going past localization to the next phase of their evolution, or at least they're being pushed to, which is to say, why can't the countries that you're funding just pick up these AIDS programs on their own, fund it out of their own domestic budgets, run it and own it? And that is where PEPFAR is kind of pushing, right, to this long-term sustainability, this, working ourselves out of a job kind of an idea. And in the piece, Michael talks about at least one major concern that activists have about that, which is so many of the marginalized communities most affected by the virus are communities that some governments, particularly in Africa, are kind of working against right now. I'm thinking about some of the anti-LGBTQ plus bills that have passed in some African countries, some of the rising political rhetoric in that direction. And so there's a concern that, wait, hang on, the communities most at need here that PEPFAR has done a great job of serving, are they going to get served properly if you truly go past just localization in terms of local NGOs and actually have government ownership of these programs. So I think there's two really big themes that PEPFAR is right in the center of today.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think that there are some, I think it also, it's about what in the HIV community they call key populations, right? So it's the sort of most at risk where we know that disease tends to be more prevalent, and then these laws can really diminish the number of people who feel comfortable coming forward to get treatment, and that can continue to spread the disease. So it makes it really hard in those contexts to actually bring this under management. And I think one of the things that also stood out to me is there's new data out this week from UNAIDS that showed that actually in 2023, rates of new infections rose in several regions, including the Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. And so I think that, that's also something to think about. It's not necessarily where PEPFAR has focused its activities, but in those countries, I think it's important to have this global lens as well, and where are things falling apart? Is it in those country-led efforts? And I think realistically, there are also quite a lot of countries that are in a financial position where they're not going to be ready to take over or assume running all these programs and funding all these programs in the short term.
Yeah, this is kind of something else that Nkengasong speaks to in the piece is the fact that the AIDS movement has been a victim of its own success. That obviously rates of infection have been dropping for years. That we've seen a number of successful interventions where people are not passing the virus on to their children. It's been a remarkably successful movement to battle against AIDS, and unfortunately, it looks like that's created a kind of lack of political will to carry on with the fight. And Nkengasong draws a parallel with when malaria was successfully kind of brought under control in a number of countries, and everybody said, okay, that's fantastic. We don't need to fund malaria anymore. We've got all this sorted. And withdrew their funding, and obviously the rates shot back up. And that is very much the kind of wider warning about not just PEPFAR's funding, but funding for all sorts of HIV interventions. And there seems to be a real kind of widespread challenge there in ensuring that we don't drop the baton whilst we're close to the finish line.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other political challenge I see is just in Washington, D.C. now, and in so many donor capitals, I think in London, in Brussels, the best message to push for more foreign assistance is an anti-China message. In some places also a climate message. And so what I hear from a lot of global health advocates is all the energy, all the money is moving toward climate. How do we become part of that conversation? Because we feel like maybe we're losing out. And when you think about the push to counter China, if you're in the U.S. Congress, it's a little bit harder to draw a line from PEPFAR to that objective. You can do it, you can try to do it, but it's not the same as saying, well, we're going to use our, tools like DFC to fund a port, or a railroad that otherwise would have been built by a Chinese company and been controlled by China and funded through Chinese debt. PEPFAR is a little bit of a harder, more circuitous route to get to the point of saying, hey, this counters China. So I think you've got a number of challenges, and this is just one more for the global health community writ large. And as you say, for a program, David, that's been pretty successful, that, people have generally looked at as, one of the best things to come out of U.S. foreign assistance policy, but now finds itself somewhat on the back foot. Listen, we're fast running out of time, believe it or not. But I thought maybe we could quickly mention, maybe I can go to you, David, on this one, Colum's piece, Colum Lynch, our colleague who covers all things UN, about the internet.
Yeah, this was a fascinating piece, really. Essentially, the internet has been largely unregulated, as everybody knows, over the course of its existence. And what we're seeing now is kind of a push at the United Nations to kind of introduce more and more control. We've seen countries like China successfully really clamp down on the freedom of the internet within their own borders. And now we're seeing any number of countries, known as the group of more than 130 countries, known as the G77, basically outlining, Colum describes it as outlining a vision in which governments of the UN will play a leading role in decisions about how the internet is governed. So that's a worrying trend. And I'm not sure that kind of the freedom to use the internet has been kind of top of people's lists of worries up until now, but it's increasingly becoming something that I think we need to be concerned about. The freedom to communicate freely online looks like one of the next battlegrounds that we're going to have to fight in.
Yeah, I don't know how much this is on our listeners' radar screen, but Guterres is thinking about his legacy, and he has put forward this Summit of the Future, which is being held during UN General Assembly Week in New York this September. It's coming up fast, and we've done some reporting in the past that's shown he really wants to make that summit focused on the issues he cares about, and he really has seen AI as one of those key areas where the UN should be playing a bigger role. And so it sort of makes sense. You could see how this could come out of his office to say, given the interest in governing AI and creating, kind of a rules for the road for it, there's an opportunity to think about the internet too in that context. And, you can imagine how this can quickly snowball. And what the piece suggests essentially is that civil society groups, digital advocacy groups are kind of alarmed by it. This sort of caught them by surprise, the degree to which this thing has moved quickly, and that you've got a number of governments involved. I think they mentioned chiefly China and the group of 77. So it's a block of, I guess, 130 countries in total that are generally the global South countries. And there's a worry that, wait, hang on a second, what kinds of rules are they going to want to impose if they get to have more voice and control over the internet and digital governance writ large? So, it's a pretty big story, and one that I think this piece casts a lot of light on, but we will continue to cover.
And there's a lot of interesting examples of where we've seen governments cracking down, especially in times of protest, most recently in Bangladesh. It's a really interesting example of that, but really trying to, we've seen it in Cameroon, like internet outages. And so I think there is a lot of concern about how do you maintain, freedom around that and access. And I think a lot of concern about this becoming a really politicized process and another battlefield between China and the US as well. So I don't know, I'll be really interested to see how these debates play out moving forward.
Yeah, me too. Well, we got to wrap up, but let me just mention a piece we didn't get to, but our listeners should look out for it, which is your story, Adva, about how the World Bank is using AI. If you want a good example of how a big multilateral institution is actually using it internally and for its project work, take a look at that deep dive. That's worth reading. We also have a couple of things coming out this week that you'll want to pay attention to. And maybe I'll turn to you, David, to just tease some of those stories.
Yes, we've got a couple of things coming out in the next day or two. We've got a really interesting piece, actually, on why countries fund their own NGOs. We saw a report recently called Too Southern to be Funded that highlighted that more than 90% of funding still doesn't go to organizations in the global south when we're looking at INGO funding. And we dug into that a little bit and tried to find out what was going on there. And essentially, there's quite a lot of defensiveness among INGOs about how they want to continue to get privileged access to their own government's funding. And this is kind of about the nature of tied aid. Aid was largely, it used to be that aid was kind of formally tied. Now it's much more informally tied. In theory, anybody can bid for it. But if you don't speak the language, you don't know the ins and outs, you're not likely to get there. And then another really interesting piece that we have coming this week is one about remittances. We saw recently that remittances now kind of exceed both ODA and foreign direct investment as a source of capital flowing into lower middle income countries. And that trend only looks set to grow. So how are remittances influencing development? Are they really being integrated into the thinking by development actors? There seem to be some challenges about kind of really making the best possible use of this massive source of capital flowing into the global south, and some thinking about how we might go about doing that.
Well, if you're interested in those stories, definitely check out Devex Pro. There's a free trial, so you can check it out and see what you think. And if you aren't yet a Devex Pro member, there's a couple of events we hosted this week. You can go and listen to the recordings. I interviewed Ben Rhodes, who was, of course, Obama's right hand on all things foreign policy, and worked a lot with with current President Biden, and really gave us a lot of insight into sort of the latest U.S. election moves and what they might mean for global development and for this community and this industry. So that's worth listening to. And then we had another event which was all about how to use AI for global development if you're a global development professional. And that was fascinating and highly practical, worth tuning into. So it's been an awesome pro week. Lots more coming, as David has said, and you guys are all welcome to listen, read, and check out the free trial. I will just also mention too, if you're listening to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on, take a second, if you don't mind, and rate it. We'd love to see those ratings, and we really appreciate you paying attention and listening and being a part of this community. A big thank you to Adva Saldinger, David Ainsworth, and to all of you for listening. This has been another episode of This Week in Global Development.
Thanks very much, Raj. Pleasure as always.
Thank you.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a Devex Pro member by going to devex.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.